the Iranian attitude is, screw you. We're not even going to bother talking to you. Now, I understand that Jared Kushner is insisting there are talks at lower levels. I have no idea what that means. And I have learned not to believe anything that he or Netanyahu or Witkoff or Trump say. I mean, I just don't. And then you have this emotional knee-jerk reaction to everything. The South Koreans would not support us in our position on Ukraine or something, and suddenly Trump pulls the plug on a joint exercise that we conduct on an annual basis with the South Koreans. He thinks he's punishing them. The people of South Korea would like us to get out. We've been there long enough. This government doesn't need us, doesn't want us. There is no imminent threat from North Korea because the Chinese will not tolerate it. They will not permit a war on the peninsula. And the Russians aren't going to push it because whatever happens in Asia, they will always defer to Xi, as well they should. So the bottom line is that I don't see any negotiations of any kind making any difference to anybody anymore. And I think an awful lot of that rhetoric is for consumption in the West, consumption at home by people in the United States. I still run into people and say, oh, well, Trump, he's playing 4G chess. No, he's a genius. You don't understand. He's creating a new architecture. Well, he's certainly contributing to the emergence of a new architecture, but it's certainly nothing that's necessarily in the interest of the American people. And it's destroying most of our partners, strategic partners in the region. So, it's frustrating dealing with people like that. But we have a lot of them. And until, sort of like this question, mein Führer, was mit dem endgültigen Sieg, in 1945. And Hitler looks at this person like, what are you, an idiot, and walks away. What about the inevitable victory? This is all crap. It's all going to collapse sooner rather than later. And I don't know how Donald Trump will deal with it. The smart way to deal with it is to recognize something that I hear all the time. I had a friend who just came back from northern New York. He was up along the border with Canada and down in Utica and Albany. He said, nobody up there even cares what happens in Iran. Nobody gives a damn. They said, what are we doing over there? They're all worried about what? Inflation, the rise in prices for everything. And that's a pretty grim outlook. If you look at the markets right now, I think we're going to go up, and there's going to be something similar to what we saw in 29, a dramatic, steep decline. And, the diesel is really hitting Europe really hard now. I mean, I have friends in the Balkans and Hungary and Austria and Germany, and they're telling me, diesel's going through the roof. Diesel keeps everything rolling, as we know. How do you keep the things operating? How do you keep the electricity running for all the trains? And we go on and on and on. Well, here it's not as bad as it is there, but it's getting there. And I don't see how we cope. We now have a 30-year Treasury bond that's selling for over 5%. It's like 5.2 or 5.3%, something like that. I think the 10-year Treasury bond, which is the thing that everybody watches as the bellwether of real disaster, is up to 4.72 interest. Once that hits 5% interest, we're finished with this sovereign debt. We can't cope. And what's interesting is to watch the interest rates rise and the yields rise. That doesn't happen normally. It's the opposite. One goes up, the other goes down. Not a good sign. I don't think Mr. Bessent can play the shell game that he's been playing too much longer before, we're in trouble, real trouble.
It's interesting, though, that Bessent and others, they keep discussing all these wars. So, Bessent was quite explicit. He said that all these wars more or less had an economic function behind them. That is, we're going to have Venezuela trading in dollars soon. The Russians will be trading in dollars. This was kind of how victory was defined. So obviously, the wars which are making the economic situation much worse are also seen as a way out. If we win, then we can get all our hands on the Iranian oil. Then we can get the Russians to trade in dollars because they're almost done selling their energy in dollars now. So it's not great when you see the great powers thinking in this complete zero-sum terms where it's all or nothing.
But it's a little late now to stop de-dollarization, don't you think? I mean, I don't see how you stop it. I don't see how you rescue the petrodollar from extinction. I mean, what's going to happen in the region if the Iranians carry through on what they're saying? They've made it very clear that if they're colliding with us once again, that they'll destroy all of the oil infrastructure, desalination plants on the west side of the Persian Gulf. That's it. It's over. Saudi Arabia can't withstand that. We don't know what the Houthis will do. but there's no reason to believe that they won't intervene and do serious damage to Saudi Arabia. The pipeline that runs from the east to the west across the country, that's very easily disrupted. So, I don't see any good news. I don't know why someone like that, well, I do know why people say those things in Washington, but they're in for an ugly surprise. The world has had it with us. They're not interested in playing with us anymore. They want an end to our interference, our bullying, our financial domination. Now the Iranians have said they have to have all of their money. The Russians would still like to have their money. You can't steal from people and then expect them to cooperate with you. But there is this sort of delusion, that we are untouchable, and we're not untouchable.
Well, certainly Iran and Yemen are communicating this quite clearly, though, that they're going on the offensive, more or less. That is, you see it in the rhetoric, in their actions, and a lot of this is reflected in what you say. That is, diplomacy. Well, it's seen as just being a sham, a deceptive maneuver to do another surprise attack. But I was wondering, do you see the same development, though, in Russia, that they're also moving towards this idea that there is no point more for diplomacy? Because in the past, it looks like more hawkish voices like Foreign Minister Lavrov was a bit constrained by Putin. Now, the leash is off. He becomes more and more critical of the United States. And from what I've heard, they were supposed to avoid criticism of the United States. That's what they were told. This doesn't seem to apply anymore. And again, when Putin makes these comments that, well, we will start to reciprocate and take European ships, and his trip to the southern Kuril Islands was, well, to use your language before, big screw you to Japan for getting also involved in this war in Ukraine. So do you see essentially the Russians also going on the offensive here, that, well, they had enough?
I think the answer is yes. Lavrov is an interesting man. I had the opportunity to meet him once. He is someone who probably knows more about the United States and its people than anybody else in the Russian government. And he has had it. There's no question about it. He's felt that way for a long time. I think people are reaching the conclusion that only by striking back at us on various levels are we going to pay any attention to anything they say or do. And I think that's true, unfortunately. And if you look at our position militarily in the Persian Gulf right now, the problems that we've seen reported from the fleet, this USS Abraham Lincoln, and I don't know how much of that is true or not, but I do know that it's like hell on earth if you are stuck for 300 days practically at sea. I mean, I can't conceive anything worse than that. I've listened to people on the other service say, well, how could they complain about it? They don't understand. There's a big difference between, well, I'm here in this dump that they call Afghanistan or Iraq for another 6 months. And that's one set of problems, but there are ways that you can deal with it. Your mental health can adjust. But if you're out there day after day, month after month, and the only thing that breaks the monotony are the aircraft that periodically take off and deliver munitions somewhere. Otherwise, you're stuck. I think people are tired of it. We don't have the size of the force that we once had. And we also know that the U.S. Navy is sitting several hundred miles south in most cases. In other words, 150 to 200, 300 miles, depending upon where they are, to avoid Iranian missile capabilities, let alone unmanned systems. So it's not unreasonable for people at sea to get sick of this and disgusted. I'm sure lots of people are saying, what are we doing? And somebody says, well, we're here to run a blockade. Okay, now what? How long do you do this? Do we have enough ships? The answer is usually no. For a blockade that runs as long and as deep as we're trying to maintain, develops at least 100 ships. And I think I talked earlier in the previous episode about the 200 plus ships that were involved in the blockade against Cuba back in 1962, 63, in that time frame. And then we also had ships in the North Atlantic that were there to essentially deal with the Soviets if they tried to violate the blockade. So we don't have that right now. And in fact, many of those ships, frequently are viewed as potential disasters waiting to happen. In many of your war games, you look at a carrier. If you lose a carrier, in other words, a carrier is damaged and put out of action, that becomes a catalyst for war on the grand scale. It's one thing to shoot down a few aircraft. It's another to shoot or sink or damage a small naval combatant. But when you start attacking aircraft carriers and inflict real damage, the question you have to ask yourselves is, do we want to put this at risk? Is it worth the risk? Now we have the F-35, the most expensive aircraft in history, the plane that ate the Pentagon, as we refer to it in Washington. That thing, you lose how many of those? What do you get back in terms of your ROI, your return on investment? There are a lot of problems with everything that we're doing. I'm sure that the admirals and the generals are aware, and I'm sure these questions come up. And again and again, I've heard people say, we're not fighting the Imperial Japanese Navy. We lost a lot of ships. We lost thousands of sailors because we were fighting the Navy. We had to drive the Imperial Japanese Navy out. We had to seize control of Straits. We're not doing it. So what are we doing? I mean, these come up, and the answers they're getting from the White House and the administration are not very satisfactory.
Well, how do you see my last question was about how this all might end up at the end here, because well, especially in Russia, let's say you have there's no peace agreement at all. How would that peace look like for Russia? What would a victory entail? Because one gets the impression now from rhetoric that the war objectives are expanding, and indeed it's not just opportunism as their position is strengthening, but if there is no diplomatic agreement to put an end to the war, then territorial acquisition is a good replacement. But also, just make it a larger question. If same with the Iranians, you mentioned now the aircraft carriers. If the Iranians now really go on the offensive and they begin to target the aircraft carriers, how would the United States react? Because again, this is not a good end to the war. It's not as if an aircraft carrier will sink and the U.S. goes home. This is how do you think the U.S. would respond?
Well, let's take one at a time. Let's go back to the Russian dilemma. If you go back to 2022, in April, when there was an agreement hammered out between the Ukrainian and Russian representatives, and subsequently they killed some of the Ukrainians who were involved with that. I mean, the Ukrainian secret police for Zelensky. Then you had brother Boris Yeltsin fly in with a message from Biden. Oh, no. Stay the course. You have everything with you. You're going to win. We go back to that. What were the Russians willing to accept? Well, they were willing to accept the neutral Ukraine. They were even going to leave Donetsk and Luhansk and other Russian inhabited areas in Ukrainian hands, provided the Russians were treated equally before the law and were treated as human beings. That's gone. That opportunity has vanished. So what are the Russians going to demand? I think they want this regime and all its adherents, all its proponents eliminated. Too many atrocities have been committed against Russian citizens and Russian soldiers. Things that we blamed on the Russians were done by Ukrainians. I mean, we can watch the satellite footage of bulldozers that have dug giant holes, almost looks like a small quarry, and then thousands of Ukrainian dead are bulldozed into the hole. Then it's all covered up because the Ukrainian government doesn't want people to know the level of losses. And right now, the only thing that we can depend upon as an indicator comes with the exchange of bodies, where a certain number of dead soldiers that are Ukrainians are exchanged for a certain number of Russians. And on average, if you get 20 Russian bodies, the Russians are providing 60 to 70 dead Ukrainians to get to 20 dead Russians. I mean, so the numbers of losses about which we in the West have continually lied is huge. It's beyond our imagination. There's too much blood that has been lost in this war on all sides, but particularly from the Russian standpoint. We have betrayed the Russians, we in Washington, too many times when there was no reason to do so. We have no vital strategic interest in Ukraine. None. We have never had any. We certainly wish the people well and are willing to do business with them, but whether they were neutral or they were part of the Soviet Union or whatever is irrelevant to us. We were not interested, certainly not a place that would justify American blood and treasure under any circumstance. We tended to draw that line on the Polish border. And I think that's where it still is. So the first thing to understand is this thing for the Russians is going to be what they demand. Now, why do you think publicly you've listened to President Putin talk about, well, there are large parts of Ukraine that were historically part of Poland. There are parts of Ukraine that are still occupied by hundreds of thousands of Hungarians who would like to rejoin Hungary. And there are other areas that our friends in Romania would like to have. And his view is, well, why not give it to them? And everybody says, oh, no, that's unacceptable. We don't play those games. I got news for everybody in Eastern Europe plays those games. If you go to Vilnius, everybody wants to talk about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You know, there used to be a giant pillar in Vilnius, in Minsk. And in Minsk, it had 3 languages. One was Russian, one was Latin, and the other was Lithuanian. And you know what it said? Here begins Lithuania. You don't think the Lithuanians know that? Of course they do. So Putin's right. Now, he's not going to give up part of what is today Belarus. You know, he's not going to surrender the gains that Stalin made as a result of winning the Second World War against the Germans. But my point is, he knows the realities in Ukraine. Secondly, he does not want to govern any Ukrainians. He doesn't want to be over there. No Russian in his right mind wants to go there. I talked to a former Soviet officer, intelligence officer, said he never went anywhere in Western Ukraine. We're talking over near the Polish border, what used to be southern and southeastern Galicia. This is back in the 70s and 80s. Never went anywhere without being armed with a pistol, with an automatic pistol and cartridges in the chamber. Well, what's that tell you? Russians don't want to go over there. So what the Russians are interested in is this thing that they called Novorossiya. There's no doubt about it. They would like to see something emerge that is not going to be hostile to Russia, and it's not going to operate as a satellite for NATO and as a base of projecting, violence against Russia. Can they get that? Well, they're not going to get it from us. They're not going to get it from the Europeans, which means they're going to have to impose that. And they're going to have to turn to the people that border Ukraine and ask them if they're going to sit down and negotiate with them. But I think this whole thing is going to be taken out of the hands of whatever governs today in Ukraine. They're not going to, why would they pay any attention to anything that Zelensky says or his representatives? So none. And I think you're in much the same problem with Iran. The Iranians don't want to occupy everything. That's all nonsense. Territorial acquisition is a lot of trouble. You have to administer it. You have to shelter, protect, support the population that's there. The Russians don't want to do that. The Iranians don't want to do that. They've got their own issues, their own problems. So if we're talking about turning over Kuwait, for instance, to Iraq, which is an Iranian ally, that's fine. If they want to sit down with the Turks and divide up things later on, that's fine. The Turks and the Persians have historically run the region. But they want us out. That's their number one priority. They've accomplished it largely. I mean, the reason we got so many problems with the Navy is we were so dependent upon the Fifth Fleet headquarters and the facilities in Bahrain. Those are gone. We're not going to get them back. So, I mean, it's kind of analogous, the situation in Eastern Europe and the situation in the Middle East. And the question is, what do we want to do? And our plan at this point is prolong it. And how long does that last? I guess it lasts until we collapse financially. Or we are so thoroughly embarrassed militarily that we simply can't continue. And you said, what would the average American say? The average American would say 2 things right now. What the hell are we doing over there? That's number one. That question comes up all the time. So people that think, oh, you're going to get Pearl Harbor, you got to remember that, we can go back over how much effort FDR invested along with Stimson in the War Department to provoke the Japanese into attacking us. That's another issue. But they were dumb. They did. And they did it on a Sunday morning. And that's when we were a Christian nation and most of us went to church on Sunday morning. And they killed, thousands of Americans. Okay, that was it. At that point, every United States says, that's it. These Japanese deserve the worst. And we gave them the worst. We had a big problem in the West because nobody wanted to fight the Germans. All the way up until we crossed the Rhine, Eisenhower was always stopping American soldiers saying, well, do you hate Germans now? And of course, the answer was, not really, no. So it was 2 very different wars for different kinds of reasons. After the war, we see these concentration camps, and then you get this very, very anti-German sentiment. But even that doesn't last very long. By the 50s, that's really pretty much dissipated because the Germans and we were too much alike. So at the end of the day, what you're asking is, what happens if a carrier is damaged? It's damaged, get it out of there. Because I don't think you can sink a carrier over a long range with a missile over a very great distance. You don't have enough of a warhead. You can put it out of action, but you can't necessarily sink it. You had to be very lucky to sink a carrier. Now, other vessels are different, but a carrier is very, very, you're talking about something that's enormous. But it's brilliantly built. It's designed to withstand nuclear strikes. So I don't think you're going to see a carrier go under, but if you get one, if one is severely hit, I mean, I'm sure Donald Trump will want to unleash hell again and all this kind of business. But America is going to say, wait a minute, let's get our men out of there. That's what I think.
Well, anyways, on the Russian one, I'm just wondering where this is headed, because I saw Lavrov making the point only today that Moscow has the right now to interpret UK's involvement in strikes on Russia as Britain being a direct participant with, in his words, all the consequences it entails. Now, it could be a bluff, but once those words are out there, they must be acted upon. And, well, at least it's noteworthy it wasn't used in the past. So I'm not too sure where we're heading, but we're going somewhere different at least.
Yeah, but right now, whatever the Europeans want to do depends entirely on us. It's the same thing with Israel. If we pull our forces out and halt operations, how long can Israel last without us? That assumes that we're not constantly supplying them with everything they need. Europe isn't very much different. And Britain in particular, I mean, it has practically no navy. I'm sure you've talked to the Commodore, Jeremy, about this sort of thing. Their army is a mess. It's a shadow of its former self. The U.S. Marine Corps is much larger, more robust, and more capable. So I just have a great deal of difficulty understanding what terrible things the British would do. I'm not even sure they could launch safely a nuclear missile from a submarine. I mean, maybe they can, but would they do that? I don't think they're that crazy, because Britain could be turned into a smoking heap of ruins overnight. Gone. The French have always made it very clear their nuclear deterrent is theirs. And I used to ask the question all the time, well, when would the French employ a nuclear weapon? They said, when the enemy's on the Rhine. Okay, so I don't see the French doing very much. Who else is out there? The Germans. The German army is a mess. It's not doing much of anything. They're as backward, if not more so, than we are when you start talking about dealing with this new battlefield. So I think there are reasons why Lavrov is now more vocal, why the Russians are more aggressive, and I would simply warn the Europeans that they need to take this very seriously, because I don't think they are. And I blame that to a large extent on us, because I don't think the senior leadership, military leadership, now Grinkiewicz, the 4-star may be an exception, I don't know. But I just don't see people taking the threat seriously.
Well, thank you for taking the time, and sorry for going a bit over time there. So thanks again.